Hey everybody, welcome back to a new video. On the table here I have the new Delta Pro 3, and this is the second generation of the Delta Pro series. Don't ask about the Delta Pro 2, they just skipped that completely, and I'm pretty sure they named this the 3 to align with future products. Now this has quite a few upgrades over the first generation, including 240 volt output. It has dual MPPT solar charge controllers, it has a larger battery, and a larger inverter. Now this is probably one of the most exciting product launches of 2024, and there are going to be a ton of different videos, but I'm hoping my video is different than all the others because the amount of detail and testing that I do on these power stations, if you want to see how this truly performs, you're going to want to stick around. So first off, let's do a quick rundown on the actual specifications, and then I'll jump into the most common questions that I've gotten about this unit. So first off, this has a lithium iron phosphate battery rated at 4,096 watt hours of capacity. The inverter, which is a dual inverter, you have 120 volts and 240 volts. The 120 volt inverter is rated at 4,000 watts output. That's around 33 amps. Now you'll notice that you can turn on the 120 and you have these 4 outlets. Now if you want to turn on the 240, it disables the 120 and then you have 240 output. Now this is also a 4,000 watt inverter, but it's split phase output, so that power is split between 2 legs. So you have 240 volts at around 16.6 amps. So you get 4,000 watts on each inverter. You can choose if you want 120 or 240. Now behind this sliding door on the side of the power station, you have an RV outlet, which is good for 120 volts, 30 amps. So if you have a motorhome or RV, you can connect it right up. Now on the other side of the power station, you have another door that opens up for your DC output. So you have a 5521 barrel port, and you also have an Anderson port good for 30 amps. So if you need to run high DC loads, this power station can do that too. Now on the back of the power station, you have a lot of additional ports. Right here you have your AC fast wall charging, which is good for 1800 watts input, and this has a dedicated UPS good for 10 milliseconds. You have 2 solar charge controllers good for up to 2600 watts of solar input. You also have your infinity port here, which is good for the connection on the smart home panel 2 or the 50 amp hub. And then of course you have 2 expansion battery ports where you can connect in 2 expansion batteries for a total capacity of 12 kilowatt hours. Now I know a bunch of you have questions about this power station, so I'm going to take a few minutes here to break down some of the most common questions. First off, is this compatible with the previous generation Delta Pro expansion batteries? And the answer is yes, this is backwards compatible. You can connect up your Delta Pro batteries to this to get longer run times. However, it is not compatible with the Delta Pro main unit. So you cannot take this and a Delta Pro main unit and connect them together. Now, next question, what about the fan noise? Earlier EcoFlow models had really loud and harsh fans, and they've really tried to change that with the last few models. And this one has really good sounding fans. For example, under a 2000 watt load, the fans are nearly silent. And if you happen to go above that, the fans kick on, but they are not harsh at all. And I'll show you guys that later in the video. Number 3, does this power station support full pass-through charging? Meaning, can you have either the 120 volt output or the 240 volt output while charging with 120 volts input? And the answer is yes, you can charge this with 120 and get both types of inverter output. So we do not have any issues with pass-through charging being disabled when you're charging this power station. And finally, what is the price of the EcoFlow Delta Pro 3? The launch price is set at $36.99, which happens to be right around 90 cents per watt hour. So for a premium unit with all these upgraded features, including the split phase output, 90 cents per watt hour isn't too bad. Now I'll also have a special discount code where you can get a free Power Insight tablet included with your purchase. So check that out down in the video description. I'll have a link and a discount code where you can get that deal. So now it's my favorite part of the video where we actually do in-depth testing on the power station. So we'll be testing the AC inverter first. So we'll test the 120 volt output, which is good for 4,000 watts. Then we'll also be testing the 240 volt output, which is also good for 4,000 watts, just split phase output. Now you'll see chapters at the bottom of the video that you can jump around to. So the first section is testing the AC inverter. Then we'll test the DC output to see how many watts we can get from that. And then we'll do a bunch of charging tests. So we'll see if this supports pass-through charging, dual charging, how much solar we can get, how fast it will charge from AC input, etc., etc. So if you want to jump around to certain points of the video, follow those chapters at the bottom. But let's jump into the AC inverter testing. In my first test, I wanted to demonstrate how long the Delta Pro 3 could run critical loads during an extended power outage. The DP3 is connected to my 240 volt transfer switch with all 10 circuits enabled, and here's a breakdown of what was running on those circuits. Our kitchen microwave, 2 kitchen outlets powering our air fryer and toaster, our main floor refrigerator. This transfer switch also powers our gas fireplace, but obviously that's not running in the summer. The DP3 was powering our living room outlet with our TV and security system. I also have a couple random circuits with lights and outlets throughout the house. It was running our basement refrigerator, our fiber internet and router, and finally my home office and computer. During this test, I saw an average of 300 to 600 watts consistently, with an occasional jump in higher wattage as larger appliances were turned on. So how long did the DP3 run during this test? Well, it ran for a little over 13 hours. I did not have any charging sources or expansion batteries connected during this test, so by adding solar panels, you could extend the runtime significantly. Now, how much usable capacity should you expect while using the DP3 inverter? The internal LFP battery is rated for 4,096 watt hours of capacity. When draining the power station down until it shut off the inverter, I was able to measure 3,810 watt hours of usable capacity. This result is 93% of the advertised capacity and one of the best results I've ever gotten while testing for capacity on a power station. Next, how much power is used as the AC inverter is enabled and sitting idle? Now, since you have both 120 and 240 volt output on the DP3, I tested both inverters. I started with the power station at 100% state of charge and left the 120 inverter enabled for 12 hours with no load. And when I came back, it was sitting at 89% state of charge, meaning that the inverter had used 11% of the battery over a 12-hour period, or around 0.91% per hour. I recharged the power station and started the second test on the 240 volt output. Checking back after 12 hours, it was also at 89% state of charge, meaning the 240 volt inverter had used 11% of the battery after 12 hours, or also 0.91% per hour. So it's nice to see that both the 120 and 240 volt outputs are efficient. How does the power station perform under a max load test? I started this test on the inverter by setting up a 4,000 watt load. After the load had been going for a few minutes, I checked the output with my oscilloscope and it was showing a pure sine wave output. I measured 120 volts output at 60 hertz while running this max load. After 10 minutes had passed, the power station fans were running at their highest speeds. I measured only 53 decibels of noise with my sound meter from 3 feet away, which wasn't too bad. At this point in the test, I measured the max temperature of 102 degrees near the exhaust fan ports with my thermal camera, so the fans keep the internal components fairly cool. In fact, the warmest points measured were the extension cables that I used in this test. After I finished those measurements, my stopwatch hit the 15-minute mark and the power station passed the max load test without shutting down. Now, how many watts will the inverter allow you to pull before it actually shuts down? I turned up the load from our previous test to above 4,500 watts and the power station was running this load for about 1 minute before I chose to end the test. It never actually shut off the inverter. It's nice to have a little extra power available if you need to run a larger load for a short period of time. Does the power station inverter create any interference or noise when enabled? First, using my dirty electricity meter, the electromagnetic interference reading was measuring around 1960 millivolts of EMI noise. I also wanted to test with my guitar amp plugged into the inverter to see if the output would be affected by this EMI noise. When comparing the inverter output with another power station that is noisy, you can see that the Delta Pro 3 has a clean inverter when connected to a guitar amp. Now, what about interference on a small handheld AM radio? Some inverters put out a lot of noise.
For allegedly like 13 million, never ended up there. Went to Florida for 11 million, never lasted there. Went to ASU for a minute.
This amount of interference is normal for most power stations I test, and I'd recommend keeping your radio equipment a couple feet away from the power station to avoid it. In my next test, I want to use my outlet tester to see if the 120 volt output is floating or grounded. So if I plug this in, it is indicating that it has an open or floating ground, but what does it do when it's charging from the wall? So now I'm charging the power station from the wall. I have a small load going out on the inverter. When I plug in my outlet tester, it does show that it is grounded and properly wired. so when you're in UPS mode or connected to the wall, it is wired properly. The EcoFlow Delta Pro 3 also features UPS functionality with an advertised cutover time of 10 milliseconds. I want to test that here with my oscilloscope. We're going to measure how long it takes to swap over to battery backup. I have my desktop workstation connected in with a stress test running. I also have my studio lights connected, so let's see how fast it is. So let's try to capture this with the oscilloscope. 3, 2, 1, record. So we were able to capture it with the recording. So if you take a close look at this, it never fully lost power. The horizontal line going back and forth right here, that's 0 power. And you can see it's just a little bit below that. So I decided to measure where I saw the most deformities in the wavelength itself. So from this point here to this point, we just saw a slight deformation of the wavelength and then it started back up again. So it's 9.7 milliseconds. So it is faster than advertised. So you can see the computer is still running after the first test, but let's go ahead and do a couple more. So second UPS test, 3, 2, 1. Looks good. Third and final UPS test, 3, 2, 1, cut over. So good results testing the UPS functionality on the Delta Pro 3. So if you are looking to use it as a UPS, you should be good. Now summing up the results of all the AC inverter testing, we got really good results. So starting with the 120 volt output, when we did our max load test, we got 120 volts, 60 hertz, pure sine wave. We were able to pull over the maximum output for over a minute, so no issues there. The fans were also not very loud at all. So thumbs up to the 120 volt output. When we tested the 240 volt output with my transfer switch, I didn't ever have any issues with it shutting down. It ran all the loads in my house just fine, so really good output with that as well. Now talking about some of the other tests, when we did a capacity test through the inverter, we got 93% of the advertised capacity, so very good results there. One of the best capacity test results that I've done on the channel. Also, when we tested the UPS functionality, it was very, very fast at under 10 milliseconds. We got 9.7 milliseconds. So this will work as a great dedicated UPS for anybody out there that wants to power sensitive devices off the inverter. So overall, very good performance. I like that you have both options. So 4,000 watts from the 120 volt output or 4,000 watts from the 240 volt output. So you can choose what type of power output you want. So I really like that design. So in the next section of the video, we are going to be jumping into the DC output testing, the 5521 barrel port and the Anderson port. I want to see what it's regulated at and how many watts we can get from each of those ports. Now the 5521 barrel port is designed for low power devices, so I thought I'd show you a few examples of how it's useful. First option here is a 12 volt fan. This uses very little power but moves a ton of air, so I love to use this while I'm camping. Now another great way to use this port is to charge batteries. So this is my Mi Boxer C4. It's a 12 volt battery charger, so it plugs straight into that port. And I can charge different battery chemistries. So for headlamps, flashlights, or other electronics, you just connect it in and it starts charging. Now of course 12 volt fridges pull very little power. They pull around 35 watts on eco mode. So if you have a power cable that goes to 5521, you can just plug it straight into that port and you can run your fridge for days and days. Now the very exciting port on the DP3 is this Anderson power pole port, which is good for 30 amps of 12 volt output, meaning it can power a wide range of high powered 12 volt appliances. Now I know people that see this are going to say, hey, there's not a 12 volt socket there, I can't power my 12 volt appliances. Well, Anderson power pole is completely customizable. For example, right here, I have Anderson power pole to a female 12 volt socket, which will allow you to power all your 12 volt gadgets. This just connects right into there. You can also split it up so you can get multiple connections. For example, I have one Anderson power pole to 2. You could even add 3 or 4 to split up this load. And if you wanted to power up your RV, van, or trailer, the fuse block in there, you can get an adapter like this, which is Anderson power pole to ring terminals. So this right here plugs into here, and then these 2 ring terminals go off to your fuse block, so you can power your LED lights, 12 volt fans, or whatever 12 volt appliances you have in your rig. Now here are just a few examples of what you can run on this high powered DC output. So if you wanted to charge hobby grade batteries, you could run a hobby grade battery charger. You could also run a small inverter. In case you didn't want to run the big inverters here, you could run a small inverter off the DC output. This can definitely power a diesel heater and also a 12 volt air compressor. Now this is kind of a destroyer of DC outputs on power stations. I fried 2 power station DC outputs with this, But just to demonstrate, I have that plugged into the 12-volt socket here. I'll go ahead and turn this on. So no issues whatsoever running this 12-volt air compressor on the DC output. So now I want to do some basic tests on these two ports. So I have both my battery load testers connected up. I want to see what voltage this is regulated at and how many watts we can get from each one of these ports before they shut off. So with a very small load on my battery load tester, we are seeing a regulated voltage around 12.7 to 12.8 volts. So now I have both battery load testers completely maxed out, connected into the 30 amp output. So I'm pulling 15.5 amps on this one, 15.5 amps on this one for a total of 367 watts. Now, if I turn these up at all, these will get overloaded and not even the DC output. So I'll show you guys that. I'll turn this up and it's going to start beeping because we're pulling over too much power. And there we go. So I've actually overloaded these before even getting the max power out of this port. Now, how much power can we get from the 5521 barrel port? With my battery load tester maxed out at 15 amps, we are pulling a total of 181 watts. So that is a lot of power for a 5521. In fact, I would not recommend this high of a load for a long period of time because these are usually rated for 10 amps. And if you go over that, they'll get a bit hot. So this is a little bit warm. We've been pulling this for about 5 minutes or so. So I'd only recommend pulling around 10 amps or less for a long duration, but it looks like you can pull higher than that for a short period of time. Now you do have 4 USB ports on the front of the power station. You have 2 100 watt USB-C power delivery ports, and then you have 2 USB-A fast charge ports. Now in order to get more accuracy testing the USB ports, I picked up this power bank and USB-C tester to get a better idea of what's going on. So while connected to the first USB-C port, we are charging at 100 watts. This is a breakdown of what's going on, and it does support the Power Delivery 3.0 protocol at 100 watts. Now if connected into the second USB-C power delivery port, we are getting very similar results. It supports the Power Delivery 3.0 protocol at 100 watts. Now I also wanted to make sure that you could use both 100 watt ports at the same time, so I've connected up my EcoFlow River 2 Pro and this power bank, and we are charging those at 200 watts, so 100 watts simultaneously from each port. Now just FYI, the fan noise that you're hearing is coming from the EcoFlow River 2 Pro. The fans are a little bit loud on this model. I have not heard the fans coming from the DP3 at all, even while testing the high-powered DC output. Now what about these USB-A ports? They are rated for fast charging. If you look at my USB tester, it's showing a quick charge protocol 2.0 at 12 volts, and we are getting the full 18 watts out of it. Now testing the second USB-A fast charge port, we are getting similar results. Quick charge 2.0 protocol, 12 volts, and we are charging this power bank at 18 watts. How much usable capacity can we pull from the DC output as we discharge the power station? The Delta Pro 3 is advertised to have 4,096 watt hours of capacity. While draining the power station completely down till it shut off, I was able to pull a total of 3,660 watt hours. These results were 89.3% of the advertised capacity, which is an excellent result and well above average for a large power station like this. Thumbs up to EcoFlow. Now, how much power is used while the DC output is sitting idle with no load? I started the test at 100% state of charge, and checking in 12 hours later, it was at 97% state of charge, meaning the DC output is fairly efficient and only uses about 0.25% per hour while sitting idle. And lastly, how does the DC output affect a handheld AM radio? Here's a demo of what happens when you have a small radio next to the power station with the DC output enabled.
And their great selection of the best tires, like the highly consumer-rated Hankook Dynapro AT2 Extreme.
To avoid this minor interference, you'd want to keep your sensitive devices a couple feet away from the power station. So summing up the results of the DC output testing, over 365 watts available through that Anderson port, so that's really good. Also, when we discharge this, we got 89.3% of the advertised capacity. Now, usually with a large power station like this with a high voltage battery, you get pretty crummy results because they have to convert that down to 12 volts. It's not very efficient usually, but we almost got 90% of the advertised capacity, so really good there. So you can get a lot of power out of it, and it's fairly efficient. So I love that they included that on this generation. A lot of power station companies are going away from high DC output, so it's good that EcoFlow included that. So in the next section of the video, I want to cover all the charging options for the Delta Pro 3. That includes DC or solar input, and it also includes AC charging input. Now this is where it can get a little complicated because if you remember, we have 120 volt output, and then we have 240 volt output. Can it charge at 120 and 240 with both of these options? We'll have to test to find out. Now on the back of the power station behind this flap, you have your charging inputs. Now I really like these flaps because they fold down and then tuck away. Right here is for your AC fast charging. This supports a voltage of 100 volts all the way up to 240 volts. Now below that, you have your fast charging toggle switch. If you have it on the fast side, this will charge at 1800 watts. If you have it on the adjust side, you have the ability to adjust the charging speed manually from 400 watts all the way up to 1800 watts in the EcoFlow Smart app. Now out of the box, you get a 120 volt AC wall charging cable, which is good for 1800 watts. And that's where you can get 1800 watts here. But if you notice, this says it has 240 volts input as well. Now I don't have a cable meant for this port for 240 volts, so I'm interested to see if they'll come out with a new cable in the future or an accessory where you can charge at 240 volts right here. Now these two ports right here are for your solar input. There are two MPPT solar charge controllers, so let's break down the details on these. Now the yellow port is an XT60 port. This is the high voltage solar input. It allows a voltage of 30 volts all the way up to 150 volts DC with a limit of 15 amps. This is good for up to 1600 watts of solar. The next port is a low voltage solar input. It's good from 11 volts all the way up to 60 volts, and it has a higher amperage limit of 20 amps, and you will have to use an XT60i adapter, which is the orange XT60 adapter, to get the full power on that. Now this one allows up to 1000 watts. So with both of these combined, you should be able to get up to around 2600 watts from DC or solar input. Now there are a few other ports that I want to talk about on the back of the DP3. Right here we have the infinity port, which is good for high input and output AC power. This is where you can connect the smart home panel to or EcoFlow's 50 amp hub. And you also have a few accessory cables like this where you can charge from 240 volts or EV charge through this port. I'll be testing that later on. You also have two battery expansion ports where you can connect up 2 additional batteries. Each one has 4000 watt hours for a total capacity, including this battery, for 12,000 watt hours. So I've moved the Delta Pro 3 here in my storage room where I can test pass-through charging first. Now if you remember, the inverter has 2 different settings. You have 120 volt output and 240 volt output, and I want to see if it supports pass-through charging on each option. So we'll test with 120 volts input, and then we'll test with 240 volts input from my Delta Pro Ultra using this charging cable here. And that's why it's lifted up. It's because this is a very short cable and I need it to reach from the infinity port on the back to that 240 volt port there. So let's start testing with 120 volts first. So with my first test, I have the AC inverter on for the 120 volt output. I'm running a 500 watt heater and I have it set to fast charging at 1800 watts. You can see we're getting pretty close to that at 1736 watts about. So this is supporting pass-through charging with 120 volts output and 120 volts input. Now I've swapped up the test where I have the 240 volt output enabled and I have it connected up to my transfer switch powering a couple circuits. So we're getting a little over 200 watts output on the 240 volts. I am charging at 120 volts input, so this does support full pass-through charging, 240 volts out, 120 volts input. So now I have the adapter cable from 240 volts over into the infinity port, charging the Delta Pro 3. So if we take a closer look at the screen, we are charging at 4000 watts. That is super fast charging with the 240 volts input. But if we try to turn on the 120 volt inverter, if we just give it a couple seconds, this will actually error out and it won't turn on the inverter. And if we try the same thing on the 240 volt inverter, just give it a second here and it'll also error out. So it looks like if you're using the infinity port on the back to charge, you cannot get output through both of these ports. Now just to clarify, this was the adapter that I was using for the test. So I had 240 volts on this end going into the infinity port. So when I was testing this out, it would not allow the 120 volts or the 240 volt ports on the front of the power station to be enabled. Now I did confirm with EcoFlow that this is normal behavior, that whenever you are charging with 240 volts input, that super fast charging, it will disable both of these inverters. So if you want to have those inverters enabled, you'll have to stick with the 1800 watt input with 120 volts. Now switching gears a bit, I want to test charging with a 12 volt battery. There are two different options when using a 12 volt power source. So when charging at 12 volts, if you use a normal XT60, which is on the left, you will charge slowly, and if you use an XT60i, which is the orange one on the right, you'll charge faster. So let's demonstrate that. So in our first test, I have the 12 volt battery connected up to the low voltage input port using the XT60 yellow adapter, and this will be limited to 8 amps automatically by the power station, and you can see we're getting 100 watts input, which is around 12 volts at 8 amps. So in the second test, I've connected the same battery up using the XT60i adapter, the orange one with a third pin, and now it is charging at the full 20 amps. So just by changing the type of charging cable on the low voltage port, you can charge much faster at 12 volts. I really like that they've added this, so now you can actually charge at a significant amount just by connecting up a 12 volt battery. Now if you want to charge even faster, all you have to do is raise up your charging voltage, so we're going to use this 48 volt server rack battery. Some people like to use this as a DIY expansion battery, so let's connect that up to the low voltage charging port. Now I was looking in the EcoFlow Smart app and I noticed a new setting under car input to adjust 48 volt charging speed. The lowest setting is 4 amps. You can go anywhere in between all the way up to 20 amps. That's pretty cool to be able to adjust that charging speed. So with the 48 volt battery connected up and the setting set to 4 amps, we're charging at around 200 watts. I've now adjusted the Smart app setting up to 20 amps and we're charging a little over 1,000 watts. So with this adjustable setting in the Smart app, you can charge anywhere from 200 watts all the way up to 1,000 watts from a 48 volt battery. Now what about dual charging or AC and DC input at the same time? I have my 48 volt server rack battery connected up to the low voltage port, and then I also have my 1800 watt charging cable connected up to my Delta Pro Ultra. Let's see how many watts we're charging at now. So if we take a closer look at the screen, we are charging a little over 2,750 watts with AC and DC input at the same time, so this does support dual charging. Now we have the 120 volt inverter enabled right now, so let's turn that off and turn on the 240 volt option, and we'll see if it supports dual charging with 240 volts output. So if we just give it a second here, the AC charging has to reset. You can see it's climbing right here, and soon it'll be back up to 27 or 2800 watts. So there we go, it's flattened out. So we also are able to dual charge even with 240 volt enabled as well. So let's go ahead and do some solar testing with the Delta Pro 3. Now, I got really lucky with solar conditions today. It is a beautiful day. It's around 75 degrees, very clear skies. So we're going to be testing with two different solar arrays. I have a 1600 watt solar array up here that has a voltage open circuit of 140 volts. So this will be really good to test on the high voltage input. Now heading over here, I've moved my portable array to this location because it gets more sun in the summer. So what I'm going to do with this is for the low voltage array. I'm going to do a 2S2P configuration. So these two are going to be in series, those two in series, and then I'll put them in parallel because we can't go over 60 volts. So we'll see how much power we're getting from this array plus the other array. So I have both cables plugged into the back of the Delta Pro 3. Now I will tell you guys that the wheels and the handle make this thing really easy to move around. Let's check out what we're getting on solar. So if we take a closer look at the screen, we are seeing 2179 watts input from both solar arrays connected up. You can see the icon here for the low voltage and high voltage solar array. Now what's really cool is you can take a look at the app and see a breakdown of the power as well between both these solar arrays. So it's cool to see that breakdown. Now if you remember, the low voltage input is rated for 1000 watts. And it's going to be pretty hard to get that with a 60 volt cutoff and a 20 amp limit because solar panels in a 2S configuration are going to be putting out around 40 volts. And so 40 times 20 is 800. And it's going to be pretty hard to find solar panels that are producing peak power at a higher voltage. So I'd say somewhere around 800 watts, 700 watts is going to be a realistic amount for that low voltage solar input. Now in regards to the high voltage solar input with the 150 volt cutoff, I feel like that's pretty realistic to get close to that. We're seeing around 1450 watts from this array, and we do have some pretty good conditions today. These are mounted fairly flat and the sun is pretty high in the sky. We're near summer solstice, so I wouldn't expect much more power out of this array, but at least you can get pretty close to that. With the advertised spec of 1600 watts, we're getting 1450 to 1500 watts realistically with this array. So I just wanted to check in one more time to see what we're getting. Now we're really close to the 2200 watt charging level. I'll break down the input on the screen for each of these solar arrays, but I do feel like this is quite an upgrade over the previous gen because you have 2 solar charge controllers versus 1. So even though one of them has a 60 volt cutoff, it's complete extra solar charge controller versus the previous gen. And you guys can see that this is pretty capable while charging with solar. Now, another solar test that I like to do on each of these power stations is to make sure that they can be connected to solar all the time without any alarms or beeps in the morning when solar has a low voltage. I checked this with the Delta Pro 3 as the sun came up. The power station turned on and it did have a flashing indicator, but there were no alarms or beeps that the solar voltage was low. Now, I did check in a little bit later as the sun was higher in the sky and the solar panels were in the complete sun. The power station did start to charge, so there are no issues having the solar panels connected to the DP3 all the time. Okay guys, I know that was a ton of testing, test after test after test, but so far the performance data is really good on this model. Now I'm excited to put this through my power station grading system, but before that, let's talk about some of the specifications. So first off, this comes in at 113 pounds. It's fairly heavy. Now it does have the extending handle and wheels to help you move it around, but I will tell you this thing is pretty hard to get up on this table by myself, but I was able to do it. So 113 pounds, that's 51.5 kilograms. Now as for the build quality, it's extremely solid. Like, it just feels like a brick. It's very well put together. There's no wasted space inside. I like the airflow for the fans is on the top and it just flows from front to back. And EcoFlow does offer a 5-year warranty on this product. So now that we have all that information, let's take the performance data and put it into my power station grading system, and we'll see how this stacks up against the competition. So up on the screen, you'll see my power station grading system 2.0. Now there are 20 different requirements that viewers have suggested that power stations need. Each one of these requirements is worth a half point, so if it gets all of them, it can get a perfect score of 10 points. So let's see how the EcoFlow Delta Pro 3 did. So with the results up on the screen, you can see it did really well. It got 9.5 out of 10 points, or an A grade. The only thing that it missed out on was the price per watt hour not being under 80 cents. At launch, it was set to $36.99 or 90 cents per watt hour. So it did well in the power output, capacity testing, feature set, didn't run into any issues, so very good score on the Delta Pro 3. So in the final section of the video, I'd like to talk about the pros and cons of the power station and also maybe some of my personal thoughts or opinions about the Delta Pro 3. But before I do that, I really want to thank you guys, my viewers, my subscribers, my channel members, anybody that's supported the channel to get this far. Thank you so much, because without you guys, I wouldn't even have the opportunity to test products like this. It just wouldn't be possible. And who would have thought I'd be in my basement testing these power stations night and day and just making videos for you guys. And I really do enjoy these videos, so I appreciate you guys watching them. You'll never get a high pressure sales format from me. I'm just someone that provides you guys the data, and then you guys make the decision if the power station's right for you. And also, I really appreciate the companies that are willing to support my channel. EcoFlow sent this out for testing and review, and I told them straight up that it'd be an unbiased review video, that I'd just provide the performance data, and they were still willing to send it out. So I do appreciate that. If you guys have ever supported my channel in the past, thank you so much. So let's talk about the pros and cons of the Delta Pro 3. The cons that come to mind, well, first off, I'd probably say the weight of the power station. It's a very heavy power station with the battery this big, with an inverter this big, basically 113 pounds. It's going to be hard to lift up. You're going to need probably 2 people in most circumstances to lift this up. And that's just going to be a downside for such a large power station. So luckily you do have the wheels and the handle to help you do that. But probably con number 1 is going to be the weight. Number 2 is going to be the price. With a premium brand new product like this, with all the features people are looking for, you're going to have to pay for that. It's just the highest technology, so you do pay around 90 cents per watt hour. So just be aware that is a con. I mean, just because it is expensive. Not a lot of people have a ton of money to spend on this stuff. I understand that. So just be aware that's definitely one of the cons. As for all the pros, well, this has a ton of them. We've gone through all the good things about this. I love the 240 volt output. I love that you can choose between these two in case you need a high powered 120 volt or the split phase. That's cool that you have that ability. The high DC output, the EcoFlow Smart app, one of the best apps that I've ever used on power stations. It just works. The build quality, the performance, the fast UPS. There are just so many good things about this product. It doesn't have very loud fans. So anyway, I could go on and on. This is a very high quality product, but it is expensive. Well, that's going to do it for the video today. If you like the content, I invite you guys to smash the thumbs up button. Also, I'll recommend a couple other videos if you guys are interested in similar content. And if you have any questions or consulting needs, I do have a consulting service I'll include down in the video description. Thank you guys so much for watching. Hopefully we'll see you guys in the next video.